old friends and faces here that it's really hard to tear ourselves away from, all of you. And so, first of all, thanks very much. I think, as people come in, they can sit down and enjoy themselves. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Susan Elliott, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. And on behalf of the Board of Trustees and all the members, I welcome everybody to this first program that we have had since March of 2020. Right. And I can think of no better person to host today than Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch.
Thank you.
But before we get started and I introduce you, to Ambassador Yovanovitch, just to tell you a little bit about, first, I'd like to tell you that our chairman of our Board of Trustees, Jeffrey Schaefer, had planned to be here, but unfortunately he, at the last minute, couldn't come. So I'm welcoming you on his behalf. And I'd also like to recognize, because we are live streaming this event, I'd like to recognize another one of our Board of Trustees, Grace Kinnan-Warnicki, who I think is watching on the camera. So hi, Grace. We're sorry that you can't be here with us, but she also is the Chairman Emeritus of the Board of Trustees of the NCAFP and has been a very active member and good friend to Ambassador Yovanovitch over the years. And just to tell you a little bit about the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, we're just really so happy. This was the bread and butter of our work, to have in-person programs like this until the pandemic. And fortunately, we were able to continue to do things virtually, like I'm sure all of you have done. But I guess it really tells me it's not quite the same. You can have a much bigger audience if you do things virtually, but to be able to talk to people and see people who you haven't seen for a long time, and to host someone like Ambassador Yovanovitch, is really a great honor for me. And just to give you a little bit about what we've been doing, because you're all our supporters, so that you know that I'd say the staff and I have worked harder during the pandemic than we did maybe before the pandemic, but we've conducted over 30 public and private programs. Most of them have been virtual, but we engaged scholars, we did policymakers from around the world, and we did book talks, sort of similar to what we're going to do tonight with Ambassador Yovanovitch, but we also did briefings. And for those of you who don't know, but our Forum on Asia-Pacific Security is really our flagship program with Track 2 and Track 1.5 discussions. And back in March of 2020, I thought, well, how can we survive if we can't talk to people in person, especially people in conflict who perhaps don't like one another. But we have successfully moved our Track 2 discussions online, and even we do a cross-strait dialogue with mainland China and Taiwan. We also have talks on North Korea with the people from the region, and we have started what we call an emerging leaders program. So rather than talking to scholars who are kind of like my age, we've looked now to engage the next generation of scholars, not only from the US, but from these countries. And that's been a really important part of our work. And in fact, the scholars who met online, we then have met in person in this room a couple weeks ago. So that was our first in-person program where we brought people from, Korea and Japan. So just thanking all of you for being such great supporters of all the work that that we do. And if you want to look at our website, you can see where we have lots of reports of the work that we've done over the past 2 years. And I'd like now to just give you a little bit of the sense for how we're going to conduct tonight's discussion, and then I'll introduce the ambassador. But what we're going to do is we're going to engage in probably maybe 30, 40 minutes of discussion. We want to ask her about her book. We want to ask her about her diplomatic career. I've got all kinds of questions that I want to ask her, but we also would like to take questions from the audience. And what we thought the best way to do it, and I think you all had on your chair, or you can get from our staff, You can write out questions that then you can give to us, and we will use those for the discussion period so that everyone gets a chance to ask questions. The room is small, and so I don't think it'll be that hard. And hopefully, as we go through the program with Ambassador Yovanovitch, you'll think of things that you want to ask her. Because if you haven't read her book, I highly recommend it, because I know that, I think everyone in the room knows her from her testimony at the impeachment hearings. But the book, that's just a small part of your book, really. She talks a lot about her foreign service career and her life and her parents, and it just really gives you a great insight into how she became such a fantastic diplomat. So I encourage you, and we have the books for sale if you want, and she'll sign your book if you buy it from us or if you've already purchased it tonight. So anyway, I highly recommend the book. But let me get to the best part of the evening, and that's for me to introduce Ambassador Yovanovitch. So Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch is currently a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Diplomacy at Georgetown University. And as you all know, she had a very distinguished career as a U.S. Diplomat, a U.S. career foreign service officer, and accomplished something that very few other diplomats have done. She had 3 ambassadorships. That puts her sort of in the league with Ambassador Pickering. I mean, but
Not quite.
but very few people have that many ambassadorships. But anyway, we all know she was U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, but she was also U.S. Ambassador to Armenia, and as well U.S. Ambassador to the Kyrgyz Republic. But in addition to her ambassadorships, she had a variety of senior positions she held at the State Department in Washington. She was Dean of the School of Language Studies at the State Department's Foreign Service Institute. She was Deputy Commandant and International Advisor at the Dwight D. Eisenhower School for National Security and Resource Strategy at National Defense University. So she, as is familiar, worked with the military, and following her retirement, she's received a lot of very great awards, including the Trainer Award for Excellence in the Conduct of Diplomacy from Georgetown University. She also got, and this is from my alma mater, the inaugural Richard Lugar Award from the Hamilton Lugar School of International and Global Affairs at Indiana University, and I'm on the Dean's Advisory Council there. I didn't influence them to give you the award, but I think they made a great choice. And then she also got the 2020 Penn Benson Courage Award from PEN America, and the Morgenthau Award from the Armenian Assembly of America, the American Spirit Award for Distinguished Public Service from the Common Good of the Paul Douglas Award for Ethics in Government. So you can see that people have recognized the great work that Ambassador Yovanovitch has done. So, and I also want to confess before we start, you probably realize this, that I've known the ambassador, who I call Masha, but for a long time. I've known her since 1993. We served in Moscow together, and then our paths have crossed many times since then, when she was ambassador in the Kyrgyz Republic, but both of us, when she was ambassador in Ukraine, I visited, so both of us have really spent most of our careers working on countries of former Soviet Union. And so with that, I want to really, first of all, welcome you, Ambassador Yovanovitch, for coming. I mean, we're so pleased to have you, especially to have you here at the first of our, what I hope will be continuing in-person events here in New York. But first of all, congratulations on your book. And for those of you who haven't read it, it's really easy to read, hard to put down, and just a fascinating description of your life, what your life has been. And as I said, once everyone kind of knows you from your testimony at the impeachment hearings, which was phenomenal. I was at Tokyo and I got up at 3 a.m. to watch it. So I really, it was great anyway. But what people may not know is that you and your family are immigrants to the U.S. and you immigrated, your parents actually immigrated from countries of former Soviet Union, from Germany through Canada to the U.S. And I wondered maybe if you would just if we start out, just tell us a little bit about yourself and your life, and maybe how your life with your family and your parents kind of influenced you to go into the career that you chose as a diplomat.
Well, thank you, and it's such a pleasure to be here with everybody tonight. It's really an honor, especially since you haven't done this in person for quite some time. So it's really really great to be here with you. Yeah, my parents were huge influences on my life. They were amazing, amazing people. They were immigrants to the United States. They had grown up in Europe during World War II, and witnessed a lot of carnage and horror, and that really influenced them profoundly, as it would, I think, anybody. They made their way to the United States. I was 3 years old when we arrived in this, bucolic little town of Connecticut, not too far from Manhattan. My parents were just so grateful that the U.S. took us in, that they had found a place where they could bring up their children, in peace and security, where there would be opportunity. But most of all, they valued the American values, democracy, the ability to worship as they pleased. That was really important to them, that they were able to say what they wanted, that they could, just all those First Amendment rights, right? And they really valued that, and they brought my brother and I up to value it as well, and not to take it for granted. That democracy is something that they did not grow up with. Growing up in, my father grew up in Yugoslavia and then was taken prisoner of war, and then was in wartime France. My mother grew up in Nazi Germany as a half Russian person. She was stateless. And those were really, really tough times for both of them. And so they never took what we had in the United States for granted. And they felt, even though we came, we didn't have, a lot. We had this tiny little black car, and all of our worldly possessions were in that car. And we didn't have a lot, but my parents thought we were rich in the important things. And that's how they brought us up. And they said, we were fortunate, my brother and I, because we were living in the United States. And, we could do and be anything we wanted to be. And we needed to give back because we were fortunate. And how we wanted to do that was entirely up to us, but we needed to give back. And my parents, kind of set the example. They were both teachers. And they, brought up generations of students, in the classroom, but also outside of the classroom. And one of the great things about, kind of doing this book tour is that I often run into their students, all over the country.
Wow.
And, they'll come up to me and they'll say, I remember your father, and, tell me some story that, of course, I had no idea about. Or, I remember your mom. And it's just really nice to be able to remember them in that really positive way. And so, when I, like most people, I assume, my early years after college, I sort of meandered around. I had thought about diplomacy in the Foreign Service, but I hadn't really, stuck on it. I worked here, actually in Manhattan, in advertising and marketing. But then I decided that was, not. That wasn't it for me, and so I went back to my original idea of diplomacy, because that married up my interests, my passion for history and politics and travel, and this is a career where you get paid to travel, you get paid to meet people from other cultures, and you get to do, all sorts of amazing things. So it married up my interests with the idea of giving back and serving the American people who had given our family so much.
Well, and I can see where that, actually it's a great career choice for you, just because you kind of understood and you had language ability, and because you had lived also, even before you joined the Foreign Service, didn't you study languages in Russia as well?
Yeah, I spent some time in Moscow.
So I guess maybe tell us a little bit about, because in the book you talk about, maybe the challenges and that not only you, but all women faced in the U.S. diplomatic service, especially well, until, for those of you who don't know, until 1980, I mean, a woman couldn't even be in the Foreign Service if she were married. If you got married, you had to quit. So that did change in 1980, but still the culture of, kind of just being men and that women were not seen as maybe equals to the men was still there. And I just wondered, because you talk about that in the book, how did that affect your ability? Because clearly you were able to succeed and thrive, but maybe talk a little bit about the.
Well, we both did.
And I remember some of the things she talked about, in the book, but how did that affect your career choices? Did you ever feel like you wanted to quit, or you wanted to look for another job?
Oh yeah. So, the Foreign Service, the State Department is, just like the military is a reflection of our society. So is the Foreign Service. And so I can see that there are women of a certain age that may remember those times and maybe even before. And we stand on the shoulders of the pioneering women who came before us in the State Department. I really don't know how they, forged ahead in their careers, but there was a handful that did and did very well. So I came in 1986, 6 years after the last Foreign Service Act, and there was all sorts of the legislation, kind of called for greater opportunities for the likes of us, and changed how promotions were made and various other things. And among the crusty, and I apologize to any of the males who might be offended by this, but the crusty men at the State Department, all of whom were our bosses, right? Because there were very few women bosses at that time. And it was very openly discussed how this was completely unfair, and women and minorities were getting a leg up, to the disadvantage of what
men.
People proudly in the day called, pale male and Yale.
I guess we can't say that because we're in the Yale Club, but anyway.
Well, I thought it
but
had a
our
certain
member
resonance.
is a woman. The member of ours is a woman who.
Well, see,
got
so
us in
times
here.
are changing.
Yeah.
So it was, it was just tough, and it's still hard for me to talk about, because even though we served together in Moscow, we didn't talk about
Right.
the fact that we weren't always welcomed in meetings, and people didn't think that we could do the work and so forth. I mean, at that time, mostly women kept their heads down and worked hard. And that was certainly my philosophy, that I wasn't going to be complaining. I was just going to do the best I could, and that hopefully good work would be recognized and rewarded. And for the younger women in the room, you may be surprised that was the way we operated back then. And but I did do one thing. So I wanted to be a political officer. I wanted to do analysis of political events. I wanted to do reporting. I wanted to meet the people that were, important in the country that I was in their political life. And I had been put into the management the management specialty, which meant that I wasn't going to be doing that kind of work. And so I won't bore you with all the technical aspects of this. It was very hard to switch from one specialty to another. But I did, everything I could think of. I volunteered. I, went to a hardship post. My first post was Somalia, because I thought if I went there, I would get the experience that I needed doing political work. It didn't quite work out that way. But I did everything I could think of, and nothing was working. And so finally, I was thinking, is this what I want to do? Because I joined to do a particular kind of work, and I'm not getting those opportunities. And I got, as I was getting close to making that decision, I mean, it was like manna from heaven. I got a letter from the personnel office that said, as a result of a class action lawsuit, the State Department has had to come up with a remedy, and are you interested in becoming, one of the women that might benefit from this? And so I I thought, well, yeah, I am. And so I applied, and I was actually one of the 14 women chosen to benefit from this remedy. But because this lawsuit had, was talked about and discussed and criticized all over the State Department as, a bunch of troublemaking women, and, it was unfair and taking opportunities away from men, I never told anybody at the State Department that I was a beneficiary of this lawsuit, because I felt that I would be discriminated against. The State Department, they had to produce this remedy. I mean, it was ordered by an appellate court, because it was found that the State Department, which fought this lawsuit for decades, discriminated when it came to the exam, discriminated when it came to taking women in, discriminated when it came to assigning them their specialties, discriminated when it came to assigning women their jobs, and discriminated when it came to promotions. So kind of, the whole shooting match. The State Department was discriminating against women. And the State Department fought that, as I said, for decades. And there was a whole cohort of leaders at the State Department that was behind this. And I thought, if I tell anybody, if I share anybody that I am one of the people that benefited from this, it's not going to go well for me. So I never did until I wrote this book. Because I think the important thing to remember is you can work hard, you can even be lucky, but sometimes everything is stacked against you. And so sometimes, legal remedies are the way that, we get our institutions to live up to our ideals. And I think, that's an important thing to know, because it's part of the arsenal in terms of how we get to, that better place.
Well, and I think it gave you an opportunity that, and not just you, but all women, an opportunity to be able to at least show that they had potential, because clearly you had a potential that they weren't recognizing, and had this not happened, you may not have been able to fulfill, and do everything that you did, not because you couldn't do it, but because you weren't given the opportunity to do it.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
And so the, one of the things, looking back at it, the effect of gaslighting on how we perceive ourselves. I mean, I, had proved myself, in that first job that I got, and then over time, and then I proved myself in 3 ambassadorships, and yet I was still, quiet about this, how I had been given the opportunity until I wrote this book, because I was worried that, somebody out there would, think that I didn't deserve it.
Well,
So
it's hard to
gaslighting is
believe,
a
but
hard thing.
I fully understand what you said, because I lived the same thing with you, at the same time. But let's maybe fast forward a little bit to, start talk about Ukraine. And maybe some of the people in the audience don't know, they know you were the ambassador, but you also served as the deputy chief of mission in Ukraine. And in the book, you talk about, the corruption that you saw even then, and, the kinds of things that then came to light, when you were the ambassador. But I'm wondering, maybe even thinking about, why you decided, what you saw then, and were there things that maybe you thought would, you could have changed, like if you could go back, that you would be different, or when you were ambassador, because to me, part of the whole experience with what happened in terms of the impeachment, and but has to do with corruption in Ukraine, and how that we and our people in our government, kind of tapped into that, and
corruption in the U.S.
Yeah, and that you were, I don't know if I say caught in the middle, but you were really caught in this web of corruption. But would you have predicted this would have happened, when you were there earlier? And
Not even when I was there the second time. I mean, this was, I don't have that good an imagination. So I was there from 2001 to 2004 as the number 2, the deputy chief of mission. And that was only 10 years after independence. Soviet Union broke apart in 1991. I arrived on the 10-year anniversary. Only time I've ever met Putin was when Putin came to, new president of Russia. he came to Ukraine to celebrate with the Ukrainians their 10-year anniversary of independence. So ironically,
Wow.
You know, I mean, those were tough times, I think, for all of the former republics, now countries, trying to develop into, you know, most of the leaders said they wanted to develop into democracies, they wanted capitalism. Most of them, you know, didn't have, you know, a very good grasp of what that actually meant, and they certainly didn't have a good grasp of how to get there and how painful it would be, and you know, what it would mean in terms of breaking everybody's rice bowl. And you know, in those early years, as they were sort of trying to put things into place, there was this parallel system, the oligarch system, that developed, where those who were, you know, young and strong and ruthless, or you know, were in the security services and had connections and so forth, they were snapping up all the state properties and things like that and becoming very wealthy and very powerful. And you know, people saw this and felt it was unfair. And I think, you know, for many, you know, just ordinary people, you know, if that's what democracy is, if that's what capitalism is, you know, you can keep it, because, you know, this is not benefiting us. And of course, you know, there were advances, but, you know, just like in the US, people pocket, you know, the good things, and they look back to, you know, the days when they were able to go, you know, to the Black Sea for, you know, 5 rubles, and, you know, for 6 weeks at the factory dacha down there, and, you know, they remember the good things that have been, that are no longer accessible to them, and they take for granted, you know, some of the advances that have been made. So fast forward to 2001, Kuchma was president. He was the second president, and he had a multi-vector foreign policy, which basically was, you know, I am sort of a littler country, although Ukraine, as you know, is a very large country, and relatively wealthy, if only that wealth would accrue to the people. And, but, you know, we want to be friends with Russia, we want to be friends with the United States, you know, we want to get the most we can from each of those partners. But you know, as I said, the oligarch system was gaining ground, but at the same time, civil society was also becoming active in Ukraine, and it was inspiring to me to see that. And we certainly supported it through our assistance programs. So you know, civil society is something that we take for granted. You know, when I talk about it, often people don't even know what I mean by that term. But what we mean by it is groups like this one that are interested in foreign policy, and, you know, get a study group together to go to Poland to see what's going on there, and, you know, how can we, you know, help advance the discussion or help concretely Ukrainian refugees. It's, you know, the Girl Scouts, it's the Boy Scouts, it's the Benevolent Society to help the police, it's, you know, neighbors getting together because there's an unsafe area on the road that needs either a stop sign or a stoplight, and petitioning, you know, your local mayor or whoever is in charge that really we need to get this fixed because it is dangerous here. None of that really existed in the Soviet Union. Everything was through the party, the Communist Party. And, you know, even if it was a chess club, it went through the Communist Party, because you wouldn't want, you know, the kids playing chess to come up with independent ideas or something like that. Everything was through that funnel. And any kind of independent thought or organization was stamped out pretty aggressively, as you know. And so, you know, all of a sudden in 1991, you know, people could kind of start doing things. But, you know, in many countries, and, you know, each new country, I'm looking at the Latvian representative to the UN, I mean, each country was different. But in a place like Ukraine, they'd forgotten, I think, some of the initiatives and, you know, how to go about doing things. And so I'll just give you an example. One of the things we did through an assistance program that we had was not political, but you know, just providing small funds to villages to you know, help them get started. So we would train them on, you know, how you work together and make decisions. not in a top-down, I'm the head of the Komsomol and you're all going to do what I want, but, what do people in this little village want to do with the equivalent of $1,000 or whatever the sum was? These were not huge amounts of money. And, some people wanted a playground, other people wanted, the road paved. I mean, it's like any place else, right? There's a certain budget, and it's not going to cover everything that everybody wants. How do you have that consensus making? And then how do you actually get the money to implement the project and not go into, somebody's pocket or something else? And so we were helping in little ways, things like this. And by the time I got there in 2001, civil society was burgeoning. There were all these organizations doing various things, and journalism was really incredible. There were investigative journalists that were doing brave and groundbreaking work on corruption in Ukraine. And in fact, shortly before I arrived, there was a journalist, a guy by the name of Georgii Gangadze, who was getting a little too close to Kuchma. And he ended up in a woods outside of Kyiv, beheaded. I mean, it was one of the most shocking things. And obviously really, sent a message to journalists. But the Ukrainians, the same spirit you see fighting now against the Russians, the Ukrainians were the journalists were shocked and appalled and scared, but they didn't stop, and they kept at it. And that was just it was inspiring for me to see how people were trying to move their country forward. So you asked about corruption. We could see the corruption. Everybody could see the corruption. But it was not a part of our assistance program or a part of our policy discussions with the Ukrainians, or as far as I know, anybody else, to talk about, the toll that corruption takes on a country, how it undermines everything, including their national security and their development. We worked on assistance programs to help them with their economy, but we didn't deal with, kind of the elephant in the room. And that was not something we did. We didn't really do that in Ukraine until about 2014, when there was, so before I get there. So I left in the first time in the summer of 2004. And there were presidential elections coming up, and there was a pro-Russian candidate and a pro-Western candidate. And the pro-Western candidate was wildly popular, and everybody knew that he had won the election, but he didn't. And people took to the streets in 2004. It was called the Orange Revolution, and it was just breathtaking. And Kuchma did the most important thing of his entire 2 terms as president. He didn't fire on the people. He allowed the protests to continue. He allowed for the demonstrators to take their case to court. The courts ruled that, in fact, there had been a problem, and they did a rerun, and Yushchenko, the pro-Western candidate, did win that second time. Unfortunately, he was a real disappointment as president. Which allowed the pro-Russian candidate to come back in 2009. And he busily set about, stealing everything he could, and ended up being run out of the country in 2014 with the Revolution of Dignity. And dignity is, to the Ukrainians, that is the concept that I want to be treated with dignity. I don't want to have to pay you a bribe just to go about my business, to get a business license, or to, drive down the street when I don't have an infraction. I want to live with dignity. I want to live in a country where there is rule of law, and I want to live in a country where the leaders are held accountable. And Yovanovitch, who was the president, in the end, it's estimated he and his cronies stole about $40 billion from Ukraine. And, you know, people could see it. They knew this. And when he eventually left the country in 2014, as a result of the Revolution of Dignity, the incoming government was A, bankrupt, but B, they came in on a platform of anti-corruption. It was led by Petro Poroshenko, who was the president for 6 years. He was one of the oligarchs, but you know, he knew the only way to win, right, was to channel what the people wanted, which was rule of law and an end to corruption. And the international community was actually very united in terms of working together, which is not always the case, and telling the Ukrainians that we will help you, but you have to do certain things. And those certain things, you know, to clean up your act. We're not going to just keep on, you know, putting money into the money pit and you get to do whatever you want. And those things were negotiated with the Ukrainians, with pro-reformers in the Ukrainian government, but also the civil society activists that I had met in 2001 through 2004. There was a whole new generation of them. I mean, those guys were still there, but the new generation, they had over the years, you know, studied abroad, they had worked abroad, and many of them came back in 2014 to be a part of the new Ukraine and to help build the new Ukraine. And again, it was just inspiring to see. So you had reformers in and outside of the Ukrainian government pushing for reform. You had the Ukrainian people pushing for reform, and the international community working on a common platform, basically, in terms of these are the things that need to happen and this is how we're going to do it, and dividing up tasks and so forth, and conditioning the assistance. You know, there wasn't, you know, just a blank check. The Ukrainians had to do things. And, you know, reform is never a straight line. It certainly isn't in the United States. And it isn't overseas either. But the Ukrainians made a lot of headway, especially in those first couple of years. You know, then, you know, the longer it goes, you know, the more resistance there is. But even you know, over the last couple of years, reforms did continue in Ukraine.
Well, and how do you think then, fast forward, because I know we don't have we really should have planned for like 2 hours to discuss this, but I want to kind of fast forward because I think in your book you talk about this too, but you know, how did the corruption in the US kind of connect with the corruption in Ukraine? And for example, you know, Rudy Giuliani had contacts with people, and you know, how did this come about, and did you see this coming? And you know, it just seems like if there hadn't been, you know, so much opportunity for corruption, that perhaps maybe that the connection to the U.S. wouldn't have been able to develop. But you know, what are your thoughts on that? Because clearly you weren't part of that. What did they call them? The Three Musketeers, or the band of brothers who were
The Three Musketeers.
who were, you know, plotting these ideas with the U.S.
So I think, you know, I could feel, you know, something around me in the force field. In 2018, you know, I would get, you know, my staff would come to me and say, you know, somebody at White House personnel was asking whether you're doing a good job, which is just weird because White House personnel does not generally take an interest in career ambassadors. And I thought, well, maybe, you know, maybe they're going to bring in a new ambassador because, you know, presidents get to do that. They get to name ambassadors and they get to remove ambassadors. It is their choice. And, you know, I would go back to my part of Washington, professional Washington, at the NSC, at the State Department, and ask them, what are you hearing? You know, am I going to be replaced? And so there were all these like little things, like lobbyists were telling people in Washington, you know, you need to replace her. But it never really went anywhere, at least with, you know, my part of Washington. But, you know, there was something out there. And then the Ukrainians started, you know, sort of members of the Ukrainian cabinet who, you know, a number of them actually were going back to Washington. And, so I was due to leave in a normal rotation in the summer of 2019. And they were worried that there was going to be a change of Ukrainian government, and a new ambassador would come in, and they wanted a safe pair of hands at the U.S. Embassy. And so they were actually asking Washington to keep me on for a little bit longer.
Which is normally what would happen, especially if there was a transition, until the next ambassador could be named, and if they were going to pick another ambassador with a new administration. Right.
So in November, December timeframe of 2018, the Ukrainians started coming to me, senior Ukrainians, and saying that I was going to be replaced, that Lukashenko, the corrupt prosecutor who did not like me, I knew he didn't like me, but I didn't realize how much he didn't like me, that he was working with Rudy Giuliani to get me replaced. And, that just seemed so far-fetched, and I would go back to Washington, and they were like, no, we haven't heard anything like that. That's crazy. Fast forward to January, and there were a couple of incidents where Giuliani was trying to bring Ukrainians to the United States, one Ukrainian in particular, who was a known corrupt individual, and that individual did not get a visa. And that was a real cause of concern for Giuliani, and he complained to the White House. And, now, knowing what I know now, clearly that was a problem, because Giuliani and those working with him were trying to cut this deal where the Ukrainians would provide dirt on Joe Biden and on Hunter Biden that would conceivably damage, a potential contender for the presidency. And that would benefit the President of the United States at the time. And the quid pro quo was not exactly clear, but Lutsenko wanted me to be gone because he felt I was standing in his way and had humiliated him. I think Poroshenko wanted President Trump to endorse him in his own presidential run. So there was just this witch's brew of all sorts of things going on. And, these two sides eventually got together. And what did happen is that I was removed, with the Giuliani and company telling the president that I was disloyal, that I was talking badly about him, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But what kind of made this thing so strange, the president could just have removed me with, no drama. Yeah. But instead, there was a whole orchestrated campaign of, lies about me, that I was corrupt, that I had done all sorts of things, that I was dishonest, and on and on and on. And, that was the clue that there was more going on here. And so, I think enterprising reporters in Ukraine, enterprising reporters in the United States, and others, got on the trail of that. And then, of course, it all unspooled over time with, not only Giuliani, but the president himself saying the quiet part out loud. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. Well,
and again, most of the questions are about what's happening now in Ukraine, so I want to get to those. But I want you to talk a little bit, as a three-time ambassador, you weren't a stranger to testifying before Congress, but tell us about what it was like to have to testify in the impeachment, hearings, and especially, like I said, I watched it from Tokyo, so people were watching around the world.
Right, right. Before I go there, I just want to say one other thing about being removed under those circumstances, because, obviously it was, very sad for me and tremendously upsetting and so forth. But the damage was greater than, just for me, because what, bad actors around the world saw, whether they were American or from other countries, is you can cut a deal with this administration. If you've got like some, ambassador who is implementing U.S. policy and calling people out on, corruption and trying to help the forces that are, working for the good and all of that, and that's not to your liking, talk to Rudy Giuliani, and he can fix that problem for you. Obviously I'm exaggerating when I say this, but I think bad actors took a message from this, that there is a way to get your way with this administration, And I think that's tremendously damaging. And I think it was damaging also for my colleagues who are watching this and implementing US policy, as I was, and wondering, man, if I do hard things for our government, is our government going to have my back?
Or is that going to happen to me?
Exactly.
Yeah, is what happened to Ambassador Yovanovitch going to happen to me?
So, the whole thing in that incident was damaging far beyond, my own personal experience.
Well, and they could have easily have just asked you to leave because there was a new administration, which is a normal thing, ambassador, especially when it's a different party. Frequently, the new president will ask a new person to become the ambassador. So why I guess we know now why they did it, but maybe, we want to talk a little bit about what's going on, now in Russia. And maybe we can, I don't know if you want to talk about the impeachment hearing, or maybe just a little bit about that, because it really, I would just say, I'm sure it was probably one of the hardest things you ever had to do, but you really did a phenomenal job. So, and anybody who knows you, like I do, would know, all that stuff that they said about, you being corrupt and everything, it just couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, one of the proudest moments for me is that, when people say, do you know any of these people like in that hearing? I said, well, yeah, I know all of them. And, in fact, someone reading your book who I went to high school with said, my husband is reading, Ambassador Yovanovitch's book. Do you know her? And I said, well, yeah. So anyway, it's just kind of an honor to be associated with you. So,
Thank you.
But maybe tell us a little bit about that, and then maybe because you became ambassador after 2014, and knowing what's going on today, are there things that maybe we, the U.S. government, could have done differently that may have prevented, after Crimea was taken by the Russians, prevented what's happened now? And, so that's one of the questions that we have here.
That's
that
2 questions.
Yeah. So,
so first on the impeachment.
But I'd like you to talk a little bit about that, and then we certainly can talk about, because I knew all the questions would be, a lot of them are about, what's going on now.
Yeah. So on the impeachment, I was very torn because, I came back to the United States in disgrace, and I didn't know what was going to happen next. And, then you had the perfect phone call, the transcript of which came out in September of 2019. And, Zelensky and Trump are actually talking about me. Very unusual to talk about an ambassador, 2 presidents. And, Trump says, she's bad news, and she's going to go through some things. And, I have to tell you that I was thinking, well, what more is in store for me? He's already fired me. I was still technically employed at the State Department, but I knew I didn't, have much of a career left. And so I was worried that there was going to be some retaliation. Were they going to open up a court case against me? What was going to happen? And then, of course, events moved very quickly, and the investigation that the 3 committees had established in September became an impeachment inquiry, and then many of us, myself included, were instructed not to participate. And I have been a rules follower my whole life. I'm not the person who doesn't follow rules. And I was really worried about what do I do? The White House and the State Department are telling me not to testify, but this is this is a lawful, it is a constitutional process. One of the things, the Constitution, it's actually in the Constitution, and one of the, main functions of the legislative branch, a co-equal branch of government, is the oversight function. And so this was completely legitimate. And I didn't really feel that I had any information that was of use to the committee, but I also felt that I had to testify, and that my greater duty was not to the executive branch, but it was to the Constitution in this case. But it was hard because I was afraid of what the repercussions would be and whether there would be retaliation. And that phrase, she's going to go through some things, was just ringing in my ears the whole time.
And did you feel you got any support from State Department?
No.
No.
Quite the opposite.
Yeah. And then, so then after that's finished, but then maybe we go into what you, well, we know, the outcome of the impeachment, but then did you feel then even when it was over, you had any, did you feel like you were going to have to resign or
I retired.
You did retire?
Yeah, I retired in January of 2020. And, a lot of my friends, when I came back in the spring of 2019, were like, why don't you just retire? You can do this now. And, I guess I still needed the security of the job of the last 34 years and stuff like that. But, when I did decide to retire, I think it was that I felt that now I was retiring on my own terms. I wasn't being hounded out of the State Department. I was retiring on my own terms, that I had been able to get my story out there. And obviously there are, many who are not fans, shall we say, but those who, were open to the truth, I think understood what happened with me. And so I was able to get my story out there, and then I was able to retire on my own terms.
And did they try to block you from writing a book? Did you have any problems with that? Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of the questions that we have, we have more questions than we have time for, but are now kind of related to, because the ambassador's book was written before Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th. But I guess, what did you think, at the time when, because we heard that the troop buildup was happening, and when I say, are there things, because you talk in the book about the Minsk Accords, we know that the Russians took Crimea illegally in 2014, but would you, I guess, in your, in your opinion, have envisioned that Putin would do this, that this was coming, or is this something that was a surprise, to you?
So the book actually has an afterword where I talk a little bit about Russia and what's coming next, and I didn't predict what we see now. But what I did say is that, countries on the way, great powers on the way down, create a lot of problems. And that, Russia had this pattern of, Georgia in 2008, grabbing 2 hunks of Georgia. And, we condemned it, but we didn't exclude Putin from any of the big power clubs, and there were no sanctions. In 2014, he invaded Ukraine for the first time, as you said, illegally annexed Crimea, started this war in the Donbass, which continued for the next 8 years. There was a hot war in the middle of Europe. Didn't make US headlines for the most part, but it was, it was right there, destabilizing Ukraine. And it was my belief, incorrectly, that that was enough for Putin. That destabilizing, whether it was through kinetic means, through military force on force in the Donbass, whether it was through assassinations in the heart of Kyiv, whether it was cyber attacks, the single largest cyber attack the NotPetya in 2017, which cost billions around the world in damages. The cyber attack on the electric grid in Ukraine. All of these things, very destabilizing, hard to govern, and hard to sort of you keep on moving forward on your European trajectory with the EU, with NATO, with other things. All of the Ukrainians were still moving forward, but it's really hard. It's destabilizing to have a war in your country, and a war by all these other means as well. So I thought that was enough for Putin. I thought we were going to have problems with Putin, but I didn't think it would necessarily be in Ukraine until we started seeing the buildup in the fall. And then, of course, anybody with eyes and a map, you can see what's happening. But then, of course, the absolutely brilliant, I thought, move of the Biden administration to share intelligence publicly, that these are the intentions, this is what is going on, this is what is going to happen. yeah, that I was not expecting, and I was surprised by the raw ambition of Putin's plans to take all of Ukraine. And then on the eve of the war, he talks about other countries that are out there that may also need to be brought back into the fold. And just this week or last week, comparing himself to Peter the Great and returning the lands to Mother Russia. I mean, it is quite sobering, I think. And so I think the most important takeaway about this war is, yes, this is a war on Ukraine. I mean, Putin has an obsession about Ukraine and Kiev and Rus and the history and the culture and the religion, and I won't go into all of that because I know time is precious. He has an obsession about that, and he wants Ukraine. But he is also fomenting a war against Europe and the international order. And if we allow Putin to succeed, he's not going to be done in Ukraine and however he describes success in Ukraine. He will do what he has done over the past 2 decades, which is regroup, rearm, and reinvade, and probably Ukraine. But but in my opinion, he has his sights much further as well. And the assault on the international rules-based order is really serious because we as a country, but not only the U.S., we have benefited from this rules-based order. We are more prosperous, we are more secure, we are more free as a result. And if Putin is successful in Ukraine, everybody's watching. It's not just the democracies who are, concerned. It's other authoritarians who are thinking, if Putin can get away with it, maybe I can too. Because the West is not standing up. And that just makes for a far more dangerous world for all of us. Less predictable, certainly less prosperous because, those the supply lines, the supply chains that we heard so much during COVID, you're really going to see disruption now. And so I think we are, I don't want to end this answer on a negative note, but I think the challenges before us are immense. And I think that when historians look back at this time, they are going to, look at pre-February 24th and post-February 24th. They're going to look at how did we support Ukraine, but more broadly, it's going to be how did we react to the challenges to the international order? Were we able to reform institutions like the UN so that they serve more of the people in the countries that are out there in a way that people perceive as fair? Are we going to be able to reestablish arms control regimes and other kinds of treaties and agreements so that we have a safer world moving forward? Or does Putin and his ilk get to write the rules for how we live in the future? Because that is not to our advantage.
Well, and I think you've answered, there were a couple of questions on what do you see as the future of, how will this affect the European security architecture? And that, I think you've kind of answered that in that, it does make, especially I think, given that the sanctions were so quickly, at least embraced and started, that, it's kind of changed the way Europe looks at itself. And I guess I never would have thought Finland and Sweden would join NATO, but things are different. But there are also a couple questions, and this is a little off the topic, but on
Can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
I think it's really important that we and the Europeans continue to keep the focus on this crisis because, we live in a world where there are so many challenges and, new ones keep on popping up and it's just hard to keep attention on, but we need to do this. I think this is the single most important challenge, and it feeds into many of the other challenges. I mean, we're worried about China, but the best way, in my opinion, to manage China is to ensure that Putin is not successful in Ukraine.
Yeah. And what do you think on, because this is also in the questions too, but maybe what do you see as what the Ukrainian people will accept as an outcome. What winning or compromise, I mean, where do you see this all going?
Yeah, well, that's the big question. So I think, I know there's like a lot in op-ed land about, this is what the Ukrainians should do, and they should do this, and they should do that. I think it's for the Ukrainians to decide. They are the ones who are fighting. They are the ones who are dying. All they're asking us for is that we arm them, and I think we should. And I can't really answer that question because I think it's gonna, facts on the ground matter. We've seen various phases of this war, and right now we're in a grinding, grueling, I think this summer is gonna be horrific with losses on both sides. Obviously, we are more aware of the Ukrainian losses. Will we be able to get the long-range artillery to Ukraine in time? Will we be able to train people in time for it to make a difference? Will it make a difference? I think these are all questions because facts on the ground matter. At the end of the day, whether it's this year or in 10 years, there will be a peace negotiation. Right now, Putin is not interested. He hasn't been interested since the beginning, even though there were some desultory talks in the beginning. But they didn't send their A-team. They were just, watch the hand here as we're killing Ukrainians there. They were not serious. And now they're not serious at all. They are trying to improve their position on the ground, and sadly, they are making some advances. And so, certainly my hope is that we will be able to reinforce the Ukrainians enough so that they can roll back some of those gains, and then let's see. But I will tell you, my Ukrainian friends, after Bucha, after Mariupol, after some of the other things we all have seen, and I think it's shocked and horrified all of us. But imagine if you know people who went through that, or God forbid, died, or were tortured or raped. My Ukrainian friends, but you can read this in the newspaper as well, they have become hardened. They're like, we need to make those deaths count. We don't want to compromise anymore. Because in the beginning, the Ukrainians were putting all sorts of stuff on the table, all sorts of stuff. And that's kind of gone away now. And so, we all know that, a peace negotiation, it involves compromises from all sides. But right now, it's hard to see what the outlines of that would be, in the details. But it would certainly be, what are the borders? Then it would be, what kind of sovereignty? Would Ukraine or rump Ukraine be completely sovereign, both internally and in its foreign policy? Or would there be a demand of neutrality or something else? So I think those are probably the most important things. But I think it's hard to see what the outlines are right now.
And for just maybe in final few minutes, your thoughts on what the U.S. should continue to do more of, do less of, to help the Ukrainian people?
So I think, I actually think that the Biden administration has done a really good job in a really difficult challenge, which is to, navigate a very, very narrow lane of trying to support the Ukrainians, trying to deter the Russians, and trying to support NATO in the eastern flank without expanding a war. Nobody wants a war with Russia. And I think they've done a pretty good job of that. The fact of the matter is that there is risk everywhere. There is risk in helping the Ukrainians, but there is also risk, and I think, we didn't do enough when Georgia was invaded. We didn't do enough when Ukraine was invaded the first time. And, now we are living with the consequences of that. So there is risk in not doing enough as well. So you're going to ask me, well, what is enough? What is that magic line? And I think that's what the administration, keeps on trying to figure out. And we can see, that sometimes it changes from week to week in response to events, in response to what Russia is saying and doing. And I think that's probably a good thing. And I hope that we keep on supporting Ukraine militarily on the economic side and certainly on the humanitarian side. So one thing, I am firmly in the camp that it is Ukrainians that need to drive not only how they prosecute this war, but how they decide to move to peace. But the U.S. and the international community does have a role. We have a role in terms of providing assistance or framework for how Ukraine is rebuilt. I think that's tremendously important. There's a lot of people putting a lot of thought against this. I can think of 8 groups right now, maybe too many flowers blooming. But it's important to be thinking about those things, not only in terms of what are the priorities, where would the money come from, is there a way to get the Russian money that is frozen here in the United States or in other places to help rebuild Ukraine. And most critically, how that rebuilding happens in a way that is rebuilding the new Ukraine and not, with all the old ways that didn't magically go away on February 24th just because Putin invaded. So I think rebuilding is critically important. And then the issue of, the very sensitive issue of security guarantees. What can the international community do that would be, believable and helpful that could move the peace process forward. And, I keep on rethinking my views on this, but right now I'm of the view that, Ukraine just needs to be, as Zelensky has said, the Israel of the former Soviet Union. Everybody's armed. The country has an active and very ferocious military, so ferocious that no Russian defense minister in his right mind would ever consider invading Ukraine. So I think there are a couple of areas where we need to be thinking hard as well.
Well, we've gone over time as I expected that we would, but thank you so much. And I guess I would end on a note because I encourage all of you to buy and read the book. But in the book, it will circle back to the beginning. I met the ambassador's mother at a reception when I visited Ukraine back, I think it was in 2017 maybe. And I'll have to say, as a woman who was in her 90s, she stole the show from her daughter in that she really was very captivating, very engaging, and I know that your parents are both very proud of you, and I think you're an example of what you talked about at the beginning, is that America is a great place for people to come and to be a success, and if you put your mind to it, you can be anything. So thank you very much for writing the book, for doing what you did, and for being here with us tonight.
Thank you very much.